The boy with the quiet, iced air in the open auditorium buzzed with teenage energy, sneakers tapping on concrete, soda cans hissing open, and whispers bouncing off the walls like birds startled in flight. It was the annual inter-school music night in Chennai, and everyone who was anyone in the district's school circuit was here, squeezed into rows of plastic chairs under colored lights that made even nervous sweat shimmer dot in the middle row, hidden behind two boisterous classmates. Sat a boy who looked like he had just wandered in by accident. Sundar Pichai wasn't tall, and he wasn't loud. His clothes were simple, faded pants, an oversized shirt borrowed from his cousin, and shoes that had lost the war with time long ago. But what made him most invisible were his eyes, not because they were dull, but because they were too quiet. They didn't scream for attention the way others did. They just watched. No one expected him to sign up for the performance slot. He hadn't told anyone. Not his teachers, not his parents, not even the boy who shared his lunch every day. Sundar had always been the boy who raised his hand gently, never to ask for permission to speak, but only to answer when called upon. Music night was not made for boys like Sundar. It was made for boys who wore confidence like perfume and girls who moved like poetry. The host's voice crackled through the speakers, filled with exaggerated cheer. And now, someone very special. Our next performer is Sundar Pichai. From Class 10B. A small laugh rippled through the audience. Soft at first, then louder, like someone had thrown a stone in a still pond. Sundar heard the laughter. He even recognized a few voices. They weren't cruel, not really. They were just surprised. Confused, like the universe had glitched and thrown a quiet boy into a loud spotlight. But Sundar didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, dusted invisible specks from his shirt, and began to walk toward the stage. Every step felt like a test, like walking across a thin rope strung between two cliffs. He could feel eyes digging into his back, voices whispering behind cupped hands. Someone near the front row even said out loud, "Maybe he's here to fix." The microphone. Back out a few more laughs. Sundar smiled to himself. Not because it was funny, but because it meant they hadn't seen him yet? Not really. He reached the center of the stage, standing in a lone beam of light. The microphone stand was too tall. He adjusted it awkwardly, the metal scraping unpleasantly. Feedback rang through the speakers. More laughter. A teacher at the side waved for the sound guy to help, but Sundar shook his head. He would handle it. He looked out at the crowd, rows of classmates, teachers, and strangers, each pair of eyes carrying a different flavor of doubt. And then he did something unexpected. He didn't sing. He didn't play an instrument. Instead, he pulled out a small device from his pocket. It looked like a cheap MP3 player with wires hanging off it. The audience tilted their heads. This wasn't part of the program. "I made this," Sundar said softly into the mic. "It's not a song, but it has music in it. It has stories." The hall was restless. A few students started murmuring. But Sundar pressed a button on the device and held it close to the mic. A strange sound filled the space, the sound of raindrops hitting different surfaces. Wood, metal, glass. Then came the sound of wind, but not the wild kind. It was soft, almost like a whisper passing through the branches of a tree. Next, the faint echo of a woman humming far away, like a memory dot. The audience quieted. Not because they understood what was happening, but because something about the sounds made them feel still. "These are recordings from my neighborhood," Sundar said, the woman singing. "That's my neighbor. She sings while washing clothes. The wind, that's from the coconut trees near my house. The raindrops, I captured those. During the last storm, I mixed them using an app I built on my cousin's old computer. I wanted to show that music isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the things we forget to listen to." There was silence now, not just the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that presses gently against your chest. Even the restless students stopped fidgeting. For a moment, Sundar wasn't just a quiet boy in hand-me-down clothes. He was a storyteller. And the entire auditorium leaned in to hear what came next, but Sundar didn't push. He didn't stretch the moment longer than it needed to be. He looked down at his device, pressed stop, and said, "Thank you," before stepping back from the mic. No bow, no flourish. Just that dot. The room stayed still for a second too long. Then someone clapped. Just one person. Then another. And then the entire room exploded with applause. Not the polite kind teachers encourage, but the kind that comes from surprise, from realization, from being shown something new. As Sundar walked off the stage, a few students reached out to pat his back. A teacher mouthed, "Well done." But Sundar kept his eyes down, not out of shame, but because he wasn't chasing their approval. He had shared something real. And that was enough. But what Sundar didn't see, what he couldn't have known, was that someone very important was sitting at the very back of the auditorium. A guest judge, a man with quiet eyes of his own. A man who, years ago, had also been laughed at for being too soft, too different, too quiet. And as Sundar walked off that stage, that man took out a notebook and wrote just 3 words. Remember, this boy. But Sundar wouldn't find out who that man was. Not yet, because something else was about to change. Something that would take Sundar far beyond music nights, far beyond Chennai, and into the heart of a storm he never saw coming. Asterisk the letter with no return address 3 days after the concert. The school halls were still buzzing. Sundar's performance had spread faster than school gossip usually did. It had been recorded by a student sitting the 3rd row. And the video now floated from phone to phone like a secret, trying to stay hidden, but failing at every turn. The story changed slightly with every retelling. Some said Sundar had built the device from scratch. Others claimed the sounds had healing powers. One rumor said that a famous music director's assistant had been in the crowd and was planning to call him. Sundar didn't believe any of it. He still walked the halls the same way. Head slightly down, eyes focused on the floor in front of him. Steps quiet but purposeful. He wasn't avoiding anyone, but he wasn't chasing anyone either. If people waved, he waved back. If someone asked about the performance, he answered briefly, then turned the question around. He was good at that, making other people the center of the conversation. It made them feel seen, and it let him disappear. But that Tuesday morning, something broke the rhythm. It was a plain envelope, wedged between his physics textbook and the inside flap of his bag. It hadn't been there when he left home, and it wasn't from anyone he knew. There was no name, no stamp, no return address. Just a single line in pencil, written in small, careful letters. "You're not just a boy with ideas, you're the beginning of something." He read it 3 times, then again. The words didn't make sense. They felt too big, too heavy, too much. He looked around, half expecting someone to jump out and laugh. A prank, maybe even a test. But the hallway was empty, and the silence that followed felt oddly loud. He folded the note carefully, slipped it into his front pocket, and said nothing. Not to his parents, not to his teachers. He knew somehow that the note wasn't meant to be discussed. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and things slowly went back to normal, or something close to it. Sundar returned to his routines, waking early, helping his mother make tea, cycling to school, staying after hours to use the computer lab. He loved those extra hours. The lab was old, the keyboard sticky, the monitors bulky and slow. But the internet connection was steady, and the silence was clean. It gave him room to think. He had started building something new, a piece of code that could take random sounds and organize them into patterns. Not music exactly, but something close. It was messy work, frustrating. Sometimes the program crashed for no reason. Sometimes it worked, but the output sounded like a broken radio in a thunderstorm. Still, he kept going, not because anyone asked him to, but because the act of creating gave him peace. One evening, as he was packing up his bag, the computer lab door opened. Mr. Ramasamy, the oldest teacher in the school, stepped in. He taught history, but more importantly, He was the unofficial guardian of forgotten students. He had an eye for quiet minds. Still here, Sundar? He asked, walking over. Sundar nodded. Just finishing something. Mr. Ramasamy smiled. You've been doing more than finishing, I think. You've been building. Sundar paused. The note in his pocket came to mind. Had the teacher seen it? Was this connected? Before he could respond, Mr. Ramasamy continued. Someone visited the school. Yesterday. Said he saw you at the concert. Said he wanted to speak with you. Sundar's eyebrows lifted slightly. Who? He didn't say his name. Just left this. The teacher handed Sundar a second envelope. This one wasn't plain. It was made of thick paper, slightly textured, and sealed with a gold sticker shaped like a circle with a line through it. Sundar opened it slowly. Inside was a small card, dark blue, with silver writing. It read, Your ideas are like stars. Beautiful, far away but only visible if someone looks up. Come to this address. One day only. No pressure. Beneath the words was an address. It wasn't familiar. Not a place he'd ever visited. It wasn't even in Chennai. It was just outside in a small city known mostly for factories and traffic. Sundar looked up. Is this real? Ramasamy shrugged. It might be. Or it might be someone testing to see if you're serious about your dreams. Sundar didn't reply. Not out loud. But something inside him stirred. A quiet voice. Not loud, not urgent, but steady. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to its rhythmic squeak with each rotation. The city outside was unusually quiet. Even the stray dogs weren't barking. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath by morning. He had made a decision. He didn't tell anyone, not his mother, not his sister, not even the friend who always shared his lunch. He just packed a small bag, tucked the card carefully inside a book, and slipped out of the house early, before sunrise. The journey was long. 2 buses, 1 rickshaw, and a short walk through a neighborhood that smelled of machine oil and wet concrete. The buildings here were old, with peeling paint and tangled wires hanging like vines. The address led him to a gate. Tall metal, rusted. In places, no sign, no name. Just a buzzer. He hesitated, then pressed it. Silence. Then a crackle of static. A voice came through. Name? Sundar. Pause. Wait there. The gate clicked open. He walked in slowly, half expecting to be turned. Away. Inside was a small courtyard, clean but simple. At the far end, a glass door opened. A man stood there, smiling faintly. He looked ordinary, not rich, not important. Just calm, like someone who had learned to listen more than speak. Thank you for coming. The man said. Sundar didn't know how to respond. He nodded. The man led him inside, down a hallway lined with photos. None of the faces were famous. No celebrities. Just people working, soldering wires, sketching ideas, typing late into the night. It felt like a place built by people who didn't need attention, only purpose. They entered a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard filled with diagrams. Do you know why you're here? The man asked. Sundar shook his head. Because someone noticed you. Not just at the concert, but long before that. The way you think, the way you listen, the way you don't try to be seen, but end up being seen anyway. Sundar frowned slightly. I'm just figuring things out. The man leaned forward. Good. Keep doing that. But also know this. People like you often get overlooked. Not because you aren't bright, but because you aren't loud. The world rewards noise, but real change, real impact, Comey's from quiet minds that dare to build in silence. He slid a folder across the table. This is an invitation, not to a school, not to a job, but to a space. A place where you can think, learn, create, no grades, no uniforms, no one telling you who to be. Just room to become. Sundar opened the folder. Inside was a form. Short, simple. And a date. 3 weeks from now. The man stood. You don't have to decide now. But if you come back, come because You believe you can add something. Not because someone told you to. He walked Sundar to the gate, then stopped. By the way, you've been carrying a note in your pocket for weeks. You never showed it to anyone. Sundar froze. How did he? No. I wrote it, the man said, smiling. Because someone once wrote a note like that for me. The gate closed behind Sundar with a soft clang. He walked back the way he came, mind racing. Not with fear, not with confusion, but with a strange, overwhelming sense that his life had just bent, like a river hitting a new path. He didn't know where it would lead Got, but deep down, he felt something he had never dared to feel before. He felt possible. Asterisk the door. With no Nemethri weeks, it sounded like a long time. When Sundar first read the invitation, but it passed like water slipping through his fingers. Every day between the letter and the deadline felt like a strange echo, like he was living two lives at once. In one, he was still the boy who swept the floor before dinner, who took notes in class, who nodded politely when spoken to. In the other, he was someone who had been chosen, not in a loud, dramatic way, but quietly. Like a whisper behind a curtain, he didn't tell anyone about the place beyond the rusted gate. Not because he didn't trust them, but because some things grow better in silence. It wasn't a secret, it was a seed. And seeds need darkness before light. He spent those weeks preparing in the only way he knew how, by learning. Every night, after finishing his schoolwork, he dove into the computer lab, or borrowed books, or read through old code online. He didn't know what kind of place he was walking into, but he wanted to be ready, not perfect. Just open, curious. Awake. On the morning of the third week, he packed a bag. One change of clothes, a notebook, a small collection of sounds he had recorded on his device. Wind, laughter, bells, footsteps, silence, and the note, the one with no return address. Now folded and worn, but still sharp with meaning, his mother asked where he was going. He gave her a smile, a workshop, just for a few days. She didn't press. She just handed him a steel tiffin box with warm lemon rice and said, "Don't forget who you are when you get there." He promised he wouldn't, but part of him knew some pieces of who he was would have to change if he was going to step into the future he hoped for. The journey back to the facility felt shorter this time. Maybe because he wasn't afraid anymore. Maybe because he had decided. Or maybe because once you find a door to a different version of yourself, it's hard to forget where it is. The same metal gate stood before him. Still tall, still rusted, but it didn't feel like a barrier now. It felt like a beginning. He pressed the buzzer. The same voice crackled. Name? Sundar? This time, the gate opened before he could say more. Inside. Things were different. There were people now, not many, but enough to fill the quiet space with movement. Boys and girls, his age, some older, some younger, some barefoot, others in expensive shoes. They came from different cities, different languages, different dreams. But they all carried the same look in their eyes, a hunger to make something that had never existed before. They called the place the lab. But it wasn't just a room with computers. It was a world built by people who believed that invention came from imagination, not just instruction. On his first day, Sundar was shown to a small desk. No one told him what to do. There were no lectures, no bells, just space, tools, and mentors who sat with you, not above you. He was given a challenge, not an assignment, not a test. A challenge. Find a problem in the world. Now try to solve. It's simple words. Impossible task. Sundar stared at his blank notebook for an hour. What problem? There were too many. Too big. Too far away. Then he thought of his mother. Every evening. She stood in the kitchen, balancing 5 things at once. Boiling rice, flipping rotis, answering questions, calming the baby, checking the power supply. And always, at some point, she burned her hand. A pan too hot. A handle too close to the flame. And she'd just wince, wrap it in a towel, and keep going. He remembered her silence when it happened, not because it didn't hurt, but because there was no time to let it hurt. That was the problem he chose. A stove alert system. Simple. Something that could attach to any gas stove and warn if the handle got too hot. Not a full appliance. Just a clip-on sensor. Affordable. Small. Clear. He didn't know how to build it yet. But that didn't matter. Because in the lab, you didn't have to know everything. You just had to begin. His first prototype was a disaster. The sensor failed. The code glitched. The buzzer went off at the wrong time. But no one laughed. No one mocked. Instead, a mentor sat beside him, watched his hands, and asked a quiet question. What's the smallest part of this problem you can fix today? Not tomorrow. Not someday. Today. Sundar blinked. Then he rewired a single connection, and the buzzer stopped shrieking. At small success became a crack of light. He followed it day after day, bit by bit, failure after failure. And eventually one evening, the sensor lit up, blinked red, and gave a soft beep when the handle crossed a certain temperature. He smiled. Not a wide grin, just a quiet smile. Like something inside him had settled. One of the older girls in the lab saw the device and asked, "What's it for?" "My mother's hands," Sundar said. She nodded. Didn't say anything more. Just patted his shoulder. In the lab, no one needed to explain why they were building. They just did. As days passed, Sundar started noticing more. Not just the devices others made, but the people they were. One boy was building a braille-based tablet. He had never met a blind person, but his sister's friend had lost her sight in an accident. Now he worked day and night. Another girl was designing an app for finding missing elders who wandered off due to memory loss. Her grandfather had gone missing once. She had never forgotten the fear. Pain wasn't always loud in the lab, but it was always present. Not as a weight, but as a compass. And every now and then, the man from the gate would appear. He never interrupted, never lectured. He just watched, asked questions. Sometimes helped solder a loose wire or adjust a lens. Sundar learned to read his silences. They weren't empty. They were filled with attention. On the 7th evening, the man called Sundar aside. "How do you feel?" He asked. Like I'm building something bigger than the device? Sundar said. The man smiled. "You are." Then he pointed to a door at the far end of the hallway. Unlike the others, it had no label. No handle. Just a small black panel beside it. "That door doesn't open for everyone," the man said. "Not because you're not ready, but because it only opens for those who ask the right question." "What question?" The man didn't answer. He just walked away. That night, Sundar couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the door, about the question. What did it mean? He thought about everything: the concert, the envelope, the girl who burned her hand, the boy building for someone he hadn't seen in years, the man who never spoke in full answers. And slowly, something began to form. A question. Not for others. For himself. The next morning, Sundar walked to the door. He stood in front of it, heart steady. He whispered, "What will I build that outlives me?" The panel lit up. The door opened. And what he saw inside changed everything he thought. He knew about the future. The room that knew his Nemeth door opened without sound. Not a creak, not a whisper of hinges, just a slow, deliberate slide, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Sundar stood at the threshold, blinking against the soft light that spilled from within. It wasn't bright. It wasn't cold. It was warm, golden, the color of sunlight passing through a curtain late afternoon. He stepped inside. The door closed gently behind him, sealing off the sounds of the lab, the murmurs of invention, the low hum of machines. In their place was a silence that felt alive. Not empty, but listening. The room wasn't large. There were no desks, no computers, no blinking screens. Instead, the walls were lined with hundreds of small shelves. And on each shelf sat a single object, some dusty, some new, some that looked like toys, others like tools, a broken radio, a circuit board, a worn leather notebook, a sketch of a prosthetic limb, a glass marble, A faded photo of a solar panel drawn in pencil. He walked slowly along the walls, letting his fingers brush the edges of these artifacts. Each had a tag. Not with a name, but with a story, designed by a boy who lost his brother in a flood. Wanted. To build early warning sensors for his village. Crafted by a girl whose grandmother forgot her name. Built a memory dam using scent and sound. Prototyped by a student who couldn't afford books. Coded an offline library from donated devices. They weren't trophies. They weren't displayed for pride. They were fragments of lives. Problems turned into purpose. Pain turned into possibility. Failure turned into form. Sundar kept walking until he reached the final wall. And there, on the lowest shelf, was an empty space. No object. Just a blank tag. But as he stepped closer, words appeared, written slowly as if being revealed. One letter at a time. This shelf is reserved for the first thing you build that is not for you. He stood still, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't even pressure. It was a reminder that creation could be more than a mirror. It could be a bridge. Behind him, a voice spoke, calm, familiar. Not many. Reached this room, he turned. The man from the gate stood there, hands behind his back, gaze steady. Why me? Sundar asked. Why now? The man walked over to the shelf and touched the empty space because you asked the question. Most people don't. They ask what they can achieve, what they can earn, where they can go. Few ask what they can leave behind. He looked at Sundar, and fewer still dare to build for someone they may never meet. Sundar didn't reply. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't want to speak too soon. Some moments deserve silence before they're answered. The man gestured toward a bench in the center of the room. They sat. What if I fail? Sundar asked finally. Then you begin again, the man said. And again. Until your work speaks even when you're not in the room. They sat like that for a long time. No instructions. No guidance. Just presence. The next few days in the lab felt different. Something inside Sundar had shifted. He still worked on the stove sensor, tweaking the alert system, making the design more adaptable. But he also began spending his evenings observing others. Not to compare, but to understand. He listened to stories, watched hands move, noticed what others ignored. And then, one afternoon, as he was cleaning his workbench, he heard a boy crying. In the hallway, he followed the sound and found a younger student, maybe 12, maybe younger, sitting alone, holding a small speaker that was cracked open. What happened? Sundar asked gently. I broke it, the boy whispered. I was building something for my sister. She can't hear well. I wanted to make a sound amplifier, but I messed it up. Sundar knelt beside him. Show me what you were trying to do. The boy wiped his nose, then explained in bursts how his sister could hear low frequencies better than high ones, how she hated wearing her hearing aid in public, how she loved music but could only feel the beat, not the melody. Sundar listened. Really. Listened. And something inside him sparked. Let's try something. He said. They spent the next week building a small device, not a hearing aid, not a speaker, something in between. It captured sound and converted it into deep, clear vibrations and low-frequency pulses. It clipped onto clothing so the wearer could feel the shape of the sound, the rhythm, the rise, the fall. The first time the boy's sister wore it, she cried, not because it was perfect, but because for the first time she could tell when someone called her name. Sundar didn't cry. But later that night, he sat in the quiet corner of the lab and looked down at his hands, and he whispered, this is it. This is the first thing not for me. He returned to the room behind the nameless door the next day. And there, on the bottom shelf, the empty space was waiting. He placed the device gently on the surface. The tag lit up. Sound pulse translator. Built to make voices visible. First offering. The shelf accepted it. And Sundar stepped back, heart full. Eyes steady. But just as he turned to leave, the door opened again. Not the one he came through, but a second door. Hidden in the corner, and from it stepped someone he never expected to see. A man with sharp eyes, a suit too formal for the lab, and a face Sundar remembered from newspaper photos. You don't know me, he said, but I know who you are. He walked forward, extended his hand. I'm here to offer you something, not because you're ready, but because the world needs what you're building. Sundar hesitated. What are you offering? The man handed him an envelope. On it was a logo Sundar didn't recognize, and beneath it, just 5 words. Silicon Valley. 1-year fellowship. Everything paid. Sundar stared at the envelope, hands trembling. He looked up. Why me? The man smiled. Because you started by building for someone else? Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in the world, without knowing it, a girl who had never heard her name clearly before, heard it spoken by the wind. Asterisk. The city of invisible giant Sundar stood at the edge of the runway, staring at the airplane. Like it was a creature from another world. It hummed with a quiet power, sleek and sure of itself, waiting without patience. He held the fellowship letter in his hand, folded neatly, as if doing so could shrink its meaning down to something he could carry. He had never been on a plane before. He had never left India. His passport had arrived just days ago, and he still opened it now and then, staring at the photo inside like it belonged to someone else. The boy in the image looked calm, but Sundar knew better. He had seen his own reflection on the night he said goodbye to his mother. Eyes glassy, voice steady, heart sprinting. Be careful, she had whispered, folding a few rupees into his bag like they could protect him. He had smiled. I'll come back with something better than stories. Just come back, she had said, holding his hand longer than usual. And now he was here, stepping into the unknown with a head full of questions and a heart full of thunder. The flight was long, and the sky outside the window never stopped shifting. Blue, black, gold, black again. Sundar didn't sleep. He watched clouds the way he once watched code, searching for patterns in the silence. Every so often, he'd reach for his notebook, scribbling thoughts he didn't understand yet, sketches of ideas, fragments of systems, moments he wanted to remember. When the plane landed in San Francisco, the world changed color. Everything was sharper, colder, faster. The airport was a blur of movement and noise. But what struck Sundar most wasn't the scale. It was the detachment. People moved like parts of a machine, eyes fixed ahead, conversations clipped. No one made space for small talk. No one offered to help unless asked. He clutched his bag tighter and stepped into the city. Silicon Valley. He had heard the name. Whispered like a myth, the place where dreams turned into data, where code became currency, where failure was a badge of honor. He expected towering buildings, digital billboards, robots on every corner. Instead, he saw something stranger. He saw garages. Tiny ones. He was taken by car to a modest guest house near Palo Alto, just down the street from a small garage with a rusty door and no sign. The man driving the car pointed to it and said, "That's where the first Apple computer was built." Sundar stared. "It doesn't look like much," he said quietly. The driver laughed. "Most beginnings don't." Over the next few days, Sundar was introduced to a fellowship program unlike anything he'd imagined. There were no uniforms, no timetables, no fixed rules. It was a gathering of minds from across the world. Coders, designers, thinkers, dreamers, each given space to build what mattered to them. The only expectation: solve a real problem. Not a theoretical one, not something safe. Something messy, urgent, human. The mentors were former engineers, failed founders, retired professors, some barely older than Sundar. But they all shared the same fire, a belief that invention came not from knowing answers, but from asking better questions. Sundar watched, listened, learned. Asterisk. He noticed how quickly ideas rose and fell here. One day, a group was working on a way to compress medical data for rural clinics. The next, half of them had pivoted to solving water shortages. No one called it failure. They called it iteration. There was no shame in trying again, only in staying still. But it wasn't easy. In India, Sundar had stood out for thinking differently. Here, Different was the baseline. Brilliance was the minimum. Everyone moved fast, spoke fast, built fast. At first, Sundar felt like he was always 2 steps behind. His accent stood out. His clothes looked too plain. His ideas felt too quiet. During one of the early team meetings, a boy from Germany interrupted him mid-sentence, saying, "You need to speak up, man. We can't hear you if you whisper." The room laughed. Sundar didn't. He nodded politely, finished what he was saying, then spent that night reworking his prototype until the morning light stretched across his desk. But inside, something cracked. Not in defeat, in awareness. He realized something. He wasn't here to compete in volume. He was here to build clarity. His strength wasn't in how loud he could speak. It was in how deeply he could listen. And so, while others talked over each other, Sundar listened. He listened to how the devices failed in field tests. He listened to the struggles people didn't write down. He listened to the gaps between what users said they needed and what they actually used. And from that listening, a new idea began to grow. Not just a device, a platform. A system that translated complicated technologies into tools that anyone, anywhere could use without needing to understand code. He remembered how his mother couldn't use the stove sensor without him there. Not because she wasn't smart, but because the language of technology wasn't built for her. It spoke in symbols and terms that excluded. Sundar wanted to change that. He wanted to make the tools invisible, not in presence, but in complexity. He wanted people to use technology without having to bend themselves around it. The idea kept him up for weeks. He sketched it everywhere: napkins, receipts, whiteboards. He called it glass code. The idea was simple: create layers of interaction that felt natural, intuitive, almost invisible. Like glass, you could see through it, but it held everything together. His mentors were skeptical at first. People have tried simplified systems before. One said, "Yes," Sundar replied, "but they were simplified for engineers, not for my mother." That changed the tone. They gave him room, and Sundar built. Day by day. His hands became blistered from typing. His eyes grew red from hours of screen time. But his mind, it stayed sharp. And then one evening, it worked. A woman who had never used a computer before, a janitor from the guest house, kind-eyed and quiet, tested Sundar's interface. She uploaded a photo, translated a sentence, and set a reminder. All within minutes. She didn't even realize she was using complex systems. She just smiled and said, "It feels like I'm not using anything at all." Sundar smiled back that night. He walked outside and looked at the sky, the same stars he'd seen in Chennai. But now they looked closer. And then his phone buzzed. A message. From someone he hadn't heard from since the concert. "Mr. Aramis." And just one sentence. "We're watching, and we're proud." Sundar sat down on the pavement, notebook in hand, and wrote, "Glass code isn't a product. It's a promise. If people don't understand the tools we build, we didn't build them well enough." But just as he finished writing, another message came through. An unknown number. A company name he didn't recognize. A simple request. "We've been following your work. Would you consider coming in for a conversation?" Beneath it, a location. The headquarters of a company called Google. Asterisk. The man who stayed soft. It was just a building. Glass walls, clean lines, a few trees planted with mathematical precision along the sidewalk. The kind of structure you could walk past without knowing what was inside. No sign shouted. No banners waved. Just a logo. Simple, almost too simple. And yet, the world turned differently because of what happened behind that glass. Sundar stood outside, watching people walk in and out of the Google headquarters. Some were laughing. Some were staring at their phones. All of them looked like they belonged. He didn't feel that. He felt like someone who had stepped off a train onto the wrong platform and hadn't noticed until now. The invitation wasn't a job offer. Not yet, just a conversation. Sundar knew better. There are conversations that change your afternoon. And there were conversations that changed your life. And this one, it was the second kind. He took a deep breath and walked in. The reception. Desk was round, almost too round, like it had been designed by someone who hated corners. The woman behind it smiled, then scanned his visitor code. "They're expecting you," she said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He was led through hallways that smelled like ambition and coffee, past rooms filled with whiteboards, covered in equations and diagrams and things he didn't fully understand. Not yet. Some rooms had beanbags. Others had robots. One had a piano in the corner and someone playing it quietly. Like it was normal to compose music in the middle of a tech company. They brought him to a small meeting room with wide windows and no table. Just two chairs facing each other. As if the room had been designed for listening. The man waiting inside wasn't dressed like a CEO. Just jeans and a hoodie. But when he stood and shook Sundar's hand, there was something in his eyes. Not sharpness, but depth. Like he'd seen people come and go and still chose to hope in what could be built next. "Thanks for coming," the man said. "We've been following your work, especially glass code." Sundar nodded, unsure how much to say. Unsure if he was. "Here to impress or to understand," the man gestured for him to sit. "We don't usually invite people this early in their journey." He said, "But you've done something different. You haven't just built tech. You've built trust." That caught Sundar off guard. "Most platforms fail," the man continued, "not because the code is bad, but because the people using it feel like outsiders. You flipped that. Your tools don't ask people to change. They adapt to people. That's rare." Sundar looked down. He didn't want to be flattered. He wanted to be useful. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Quietly, the man smiled. Not because it was a clever question, but because it was the right one. "We want to know if you'd like to help us rebuild how people connect with information, not just engineers, not just developers, everyone." Sundar didn't answer right away. He was thinking about his mother, her stove, the way she pressed her palm to a pot to test the heat because she couldn't read a thermometer. He was thinking about his friend's sister, the girl who heard music through vibrations. He was thinking about the janitor in Palo Alto who had used glass code like it was second nature. Then he said, "I'll help, but only if the mission stays human, not just smart." "Not just scalable. Human," the man nodded. "That's why we called you." That day wasn't the beginning. It was a turning point, like a river that doesn't suddenly appear, but shifts direction, carving a new path quietly. Patiently, Sundar joined Google. He didn't arrive with a loud entrance or a polished resume soaked in big names. He arrived with a notebook full of half-finished thoughts, quiet confidence, and a promise to never forget why he started in the years that followed. He led teams not like a general like a gardener. He listened more than he spoke. He asked why more than. He answered how. He reminded his engineers that not everyone who uses a browser knows what a browser is, and that it's not their job to teach. It's their job to care. He helped shape Chrome, not just a browser, but a gateway. Light, fast, quiet. Light. People laughed at it in the beginning. They said the market was crowded. They said users wouldn't switch. They said it was too late, but Sundar didn't listen to noise. He listened to need. And one day, the numbers changed. Quietly, then quickly. Chrome became the world's most used browser. Not because it shouted the loudest, but because it understood the user best. They laughed at Sundar Pichai at the concert. The lab. In boardrooms where people talked over him. But again and again they went silent after. Not because he fought back, but because he built forward. His rise within Google wasn't sudden. It was steady. People began to notice that meetings calmed down when Sundar entered. That chaos made space for focus. That conflict made space for clarity. And then came the day. Years later. A room full of decision makers, shareholders, leaders, people with spreadsheets and doubts, and one chair left empty. Until Sundar walked in and sat down. Not to impress. To serve. He was named CEO. Not because he chased the title. Asterisk. But because he had become the person the work needed, he didn't celebrate with a loud party. He called his mother. She didn't ask what a CEO was. She just said, "Are you still building things that help people?" And he said, "Yes, Amma. That's the only thing I know how to do." Today, Sundar Pichai walks the halls of power not with noise, but with care. He leads teams. But he still listens like the boy in the back. Row. He still carries the note from the concert in his wallet. Folded, old, but still alive. He still writes ideas in the same kind of notebook he used at the lab. And sometimes, just sometimes, he opens the email inbox he keeps private and reads stories from people who use glass code to help a loved one. Asterisk.